Welcome to another episode of the CarryTrainer Higher Line podcast. Hey guys, Mickey here with the Higher Line podcast. We've got my buddy Rob Wilson of Shift Adapt, and we're going to talk to you about ways that you can perform under stress, be it in violence or at your job, be it in an argument with a loved one or being stuck in traffic. We're going to talk to you guys for the next hour or so about ways that you can hone yourself into a machine to deal with the stresses of life. Recording remotely today, you're in Virginia Beach. I'm in sunny Chicago where it's 6 below zero. As we were just chatting before filming, Rob was like, "Oh, it's cold here."
Yeah, I'm a crybaby.
Yeah, no, you're not. No, you're not. So, Rob Wilson, I met you through our mutual friend, Mr. Brian McKenzie. You are a lifelong student of human performance, martial arts. You've got a background in general health and wellness, sports. Tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll dig into what we're going to talk about here.
Sure. So I've been around sports and martial arts and human performance in some way or another since I was a kid. My parents are both retired police officers, but also competitive athletes. My mom in particular got her pro card in bodybuilding when I was 15, 14.
I didn't know
something
that.
like that. Yeah. So she likes to train, still likes to train. And got her pro card and then quit competing. She was just like, nah, they do weird stuff at that level. That's not for me. But she just liked training really hard. So I was around health and wellness and lifting weights and all that stuff since I was a kid. And then professionally, I'm a college dropout. So 2 years. And then I was like, nah, this isn't for me. Went to massage therapy school and studied soft tissue manipulation. Did that for up until maybe like 4 or 5 years ago. That was a part of the totality of what I did. Towards the end of that part of my career, it was all based in athletics and weird pain problems. So generally, people who were trying to avoid surgery or had serious long-term chronic pain or movement problems that were limiting their performance in sport. So that was kind of the world that I was in. If anybody listening is familiar with Dr. Kelly Starrett or the Ready State, formerly Mobility WOD, he was an early mentor of mine. So like way before any books or being on the internet a lot, Kelly was a mentor, and that's actually how I got to know Brian. And I've been working with Brian about 5 or 6 years at this point, and our primary focus during that time has been the research and development of modern breath control protocols for health and performance. So staying in that same theme of health and performance, but looking deeply into how breath control in particular can help in getting away from dogmas in any of those arenas, whether it's movement or breath or whatever, but to look at some underlying principles. What are the problems that are trying to be solved? And then how can we create best practice for people out of those principles?
And that's how I got in touch with Brian to begin with years back, was just researching some of those things. So just for you guys listening, so you kind of understand where we're going to go with this. Rob, Brian, the rest of their team, you guys got so many different names and concepts for programs, like your Shift Adapt, Art of Breath. There's different programs and stuff, but like, what's the one?
So Shift is the umbrella, right? So Shift is the umbrella that everything that we offer lives underneath. Art of Breath is a course.
Okay.
So it's a specific course that we came up with. And the reason it kind of still sits at the forefront is because it was the first major project that Brian and I did together. And then we traveled, I think I traveled around the world a couple times during the course of teaching that at gyms and professional human performance facilities over about 5 years. So we were still in the process of like one seminar a month about for I think 4 years, essentially right up until COVID.
You guys have
So
taught this stuff. I just want to make sure people understand what we're talking about. You guys have taught
sure.
this stuff to medical professionals at um, hospitals, right?
Yep.
You've taught this to elite military guys. You've taught the UFC Performance Center. You guys taught this stuff out there. So it's not like it's just fringy, like CrossFit kind of people that are interested in this. And I'm not a CrossFit guy. You guys are, which is freaking weird to me. Hey, let me see how many times I can pick this thing up, blow my back out. I'm just kidding. But it's not just some breath work for working out. It's there's so much more to it.
Yeah, essentially it's the study of how humans behave under stress, respond to stress, and adapt to stress. And we just do that through the lens of understanding how how physiology operates in those circumstances. And the easiest lever to pull under those varied circumstances is your breath, whether you're talking about I generally feel stressed or like an immediate life or death situation like your work helps people with, like it's a right now I have to solve these problems. Breath control can be part of a toolbox in circumstances like that. And then it can also be a tool that's really useful in modulating like training dosage. So if you're interested in being healthier or you have a specific performance outcome, like you want your cardiovascular health to be better or something like that, breath control can help you achieve those outcomes more efficiently, for sure.
Cool. I believe so much in what you guys are doing that Brian has taught at the last, I think 4, maybe 5 of our S12 events. You were at the last one. You're going to be presenting at the next one in May of 2022, which is in Nashville, guys. It is such a big component of, so you guys listening, watching, what Rob's talking about is not just training like a physical skill of combatives or fighting or applying force with a firearm, but looking at a whole nother facet of how to keep yourself in a state of control while using your breath as a gas pedal, maybe.
Exactly. Well, and so the way I tend to think about it is when you're talking about in real-time circumstances, we'll just use that as a constraint for this part of the discussion, that if we're talking about real time, I think about it like gears in a manual transmission, right? Sometimes you need first gear, sometimes you need neutral, sometimes you need fifth, and being able to move up and down that column is really important to optimize output. That's why there are gears in a vehicle, right? So it's to optimize how much power the engine can put out through the rest of the vehicle, right? So in your body, gears can be expressed that way through how you're breathing, and it's an easy way to kind of start to think about it. We don't have to get too much into the physiology of how it works, but it's really useful in real-time tools, or for a real-time tool, and that's where we tend to use it for professionals that you mentioned who are really interested in like right now outcomes, like a medical professional. Can they use it as a platform for feeling like general relief from stress and anxiety in their life? For sure. But usually when groups of people who have a specified outcome that they're trying to improve, they're more interested in like, in this moment when things are feeling sketchy, how can I grab the reins of my physiology so I have access to systems that I've built to deal with this? Because if you have a good system, like you talk about all the time, like building systems, right? If you have a good system, but you're off the rails, like physiologically and mentally and emotionally, you don't have access to those systems. So, and really that's why if you look at, really military basic training, like why do they care about physical fitness? because it's the easiest way to measure general resilience.
Mhm.
Right? It's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
it's just it's not, is it the best way? That remains to be seen, but we know it's easy to see.
You know what's
Right?
interesting? How many times I watch people, even friends and family, uh, if you don't work with somebody or if you're not involved in certain types of activities with people that you might be around every single day, like a brother or a sister. I mean, usually sibling maybe is not a good one because you grew up with them and saw them and all kinds of things, but whatever, somebody you see constantly, you might not see in a gym where they're trying to so guys, I was at an event that they did in Texas this past late summer, early, when was that, September, October?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah,
October
beautiful.
maybe.
What was that event called?
The N=1 exposure.
So basically over the course of a couple of days, tons of great lectures coupled with tons of experimentation where you basically pushed yourself until you felt like puking a bunch. I'm exaggerating. I did okay there, but the point wasn't to like smoke people for the fun of it. It was to help you get to a point of a physical a limit where then you could try to apply some of the principles that they were talking about. And it was kind of like what might work for one person might not work for another, because one of the couple people there were professional athletes, so they needed to push themselves a lot harder than some of the non-professional athletes. Anyway, my point was I've watched people in situations like that where they're forced to do something. Could be something stupid like shit, we have to park way far away because of the game and the streets are shut down and I got to walk that far, and it's like it's a mile or a half a mile, and you see people, or we gotta unload this truck by hand. The forklift broke. Are you freaking kidding me? And just people fall apart. And it's so interesting to watch how that works. Like it could even be something as simple as the air conditioning's broken. Big deal. Let's, finish work, whatever, go on with it. And then there's other people who's like, oh my God, I'm dying. You're not dying. Stop being a bitch.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think those kind of, whether it's a training environment, and again, it's just the easiest place to see it is when you add adversity and the unexpected in a training environment, it reveals character, right? It reveals attributes that people have. And what we try to do is to add skill to those scenarios. So a lot of times when people are confronted with the unexpected or sudden adversity, they a lot of times just rely on what kind of innate attributes do they have, and like it's kind of like a cross your fingers and like hope shit goes well scenario. And kind of like it's real similar, and I think that's the through line between CarryTrainer and Shift, is that we try to present that like, hey, there are skills that you can attain through practice that you can rely on, so you don't have to kind of like hope when things start to feel bad. You don't have to wait for a lagging indicator to go, ooh man, this isn't going so great. And so what the tools that we help people develop are not so much really specific skills like gunfighting or weapons manipulation or combatives, but it's more the fundamental layer of like what we would say is like psychophysiological resilience.
You're not teaching
Right?
them how to race the car. You're teaching them how to stay in control of the car.
Exactly.
They want to take it off road, or they want to take it to the drive through, or they want to take it up the side of a mountain. That's on them, but you're going to show them how to work the controls and
exactly
all that jazz.
That's more what it's about, is we teach people how to be a better driver. But yeah, I don't presume subject matter expertise outside of what I've developed. So if somebody came and was like, Rob, I really want to be a better power lifter, I'd be like, great, I have this buddy who's a powerlifting coach. You should call him. Even though I have trained people for powerlifting, it's just that's not my precise area of expertise. So
you're kind of a smallish guy.
I'm tiny. I'm in every way you could think, actually.
What are you, like 6'4", 6'5",
6'3",
6'3",
yeah. I just stand up straight. Yeah, 250.
250. All right.
Once you're at 250, it doesn't, like, until you get to 280, it's That's been my experience. Yeah, I mean, there's a couple guys who are like when you do well, man, like you do combatives work, and there's once you get to like a 30-pound difference, starts to it starts to make it a little bit of a difference.
We've got a guy at our gym, former fighter, former Division I football player, and he's like, he's been on the podcast. His name's Brian, and he is a big man. Yeah. He's a big man. It's like, oh, why did I allow you on top of me?
But that goes to the thing that we were just talking about with kind of like, okay, how do I want to react to this? So you're in that situation, and one of the things that starts to happen, and regardless of whatever you feel like tactically is true, or I could jujitsu my way out of this or whatever, that's not what I'm talking about. It's like you're in that position and it's super uncomfortable, and just the weight of the person feels like it's going to crush you. The internal conversation that happens is probably where the highest level of value occurs in that moment, because you can put up a white flag anytime you want in jiu-jitsu. Plenty of us have and will, and like just give up to pressure, right? Just this feels horribly uncomfortable and I'm not sure what to do, so I just, hey, I'm done. But if you sit in that situation and you start to analyze what's your mental conversation like, you start to realize that there are these doorways in between what's going on upstairs and what's going on downstairs in your body. And that there are physical tools that you can cultivate that help you. They don't change how you think, but what they do is they act like a wedge in sort of circular behavior patterns. So it drives a wedge in there long enough where you can kind of go, wait a second, I don't really want to be this way. I don't want to think like this. I'm going to start trying to affect a different attitude. So it just gives you a little bit of space to access better thinking. And that's for me one of the big draws to it overall, and with the breath work.
Even years ago, in modern times, like the last 100 years, there were training programs I'd been involved with or read about where they would talk about after an action or after like moving through some exercise, combat breath, or some people would describe it as diaphragmatic breath or yoga breath. But that was it. Just like go through some of these breathing exercises because it's a good idea. And so then it wouldn't be like explained. Definitely not in the detail that you're going to, but it's just somebody somewhere said this is a good idea. So after you holster that blaster, go ahead and go through 6 iterations of a combat breath. It's like, okay, but why? What am I doing?
Yeah, well, and I think that's where the failure point was with introducing those kind of things. Is it's if you do it, you feel the difference. So the proof is in the pudding, but a lot of people have trouble explaining, at least in my experience, in clear and concise layman's terms, in a way that matters to a performer. And when I say performer, I just mean someone in that moment who's trying to achieve a particular outcome. And so at least what my experience has been is there's this gap where on one hand you had people who were like super educated. There's actually quite a bit of research about breath related stuff. It's just all siloed away, but there are people who can tell you like to the like molecular level what's going on in each breath. And if you blink your right eye 3 times, it changes this. And it's like, so you have that kind of group, and then you have people who just like you said, I just do the tactical breath, but there was like no joining component in the middle. And that's what we tried to do, was figure out where's this middle point where somebody knew enough to talk to these folks and try to figure out what are the common threads that are taking place in the research, and then go, okay, how can we use this in an effective way to create language to help people with outcomes, right? So
Yeah.
because if you're just for easy example, like if you're a shooter and that's your thing and you have fun, you like to shoot on a regular basis, breath work sounds like, hey, maybe it sounds kind of neat, but there's only so much time in a day. Just employ different tools, tactics, and skills to try to improve the thing that you care about. So I feel like if somebody can't explain to you pretty quickly, like, hey, this will help you do the thing that you care about better, that's where people kind of get lost on it, right? Unless they have some inherent drive to learn about it. So for me, I usually use something like whether it's tactical or just somebody who's a recreational shooter. It's like, we know if your heart rate gets too high, it starts to mess with your fine motor skill. And it's like, if somebody says to you, man, my heart's beating really fast, I gotta slow my heart rate down. Nobody like closes their eyes and like thinks their heart rate slower, but everybody intuitively will, even even if they don't know exactly what to do, they'll change the way they're breathing in an effort to slow down their heart rate. So that kind of knowledge is like inborn into the system, and that's why you see it so many places, like you're saying, tactical breath, combat breath, yoga breath, box breath, because
Your mom saying, slow down, take a deep breath.
slow down, take a deep breath, it's just a skin knee.
Yeah.
Right. So
Yeah.
that's like very integrated into normal behavior and normal language for a person. What's wrong? I can't catch my breath. Right. Like those kind of things are we know intuitively how important it is. It's just hard to believe because it is intuitive or because it feels intuitive that it can be developed into a really precise skill. But it can be, and not just for meditative purposes, although that has a lot of value in its own right, for performance purposes and performance purposes in real time, which I think is really important.
Something I found that's cool. Something I've talked about with Brian, I talk with our students all the time. All this stuff can be used for physical performance, but it can be used for mental performance as well. Like you're talking about trauma surgeons, or could be a pilot, or somebody that's not having to do physical load movement, but they need to be able to focus their mental faculties into a situation. Like, now I can't come back later and fix this after I've crashed the airplane or cut the wrong thing in the person's body. And like, for those of us that aren't a surgeon or a pilot, it might just be like, I'm stressed out talking to my boss about a raise, or I can't perform doing a sales process because I'm so under stress about not paying my bills on time. If I don't get this freaking sale, I might lose my job or lose my home or lose my car. And that's real stress. But
Mm-hmm.
we oftentimes just think about like combat or some other type of physical duress. Talk about that a little bit.
Sure. So like what we say, our mantra around that in Shift is that your story is unique, but your stress is not. So people tend to think that because like, okay, I'm in a I'm in a fight, or I have a traumatic memory, or I'm nervous about the sale, or whatever whatever the narrative is, that is that differentiator makes the stress on their physiology also different. But that's not the case. So ultimately your physiology does not care what your story is, other than your perceptions do have a relationship with your physiology, right? So the way that you see your internal and external world can help create physiological loops. But ultimately, the effects of those stressors, again, in real time and over time, are the same for people. And by that, I mean things like your heart rate will go up, your pupils will dilate, your blood pressure increases, your adrenal glands start pumping, you start to release acetylcholine, and your muscles are better able to contract, and your senses get heightened, and those things that we tend to think of as kind of like fight or flight, even though fight flight refers to the pinnacle of that stress experience. anytime you perceive something as an unknown, really, you're not really sure what's going to happen, or you're preparing for action, the system comes up. And to some degree, that's good as long as it stays at a manageable level. And to use a car analogy again, it's kind of like your tachometer, right? And so, yeah, if that thing pings out and you just hold it in the red, eventually the whole thing blows up. You don't want a car that can't go in the red at all. Like if it can't tolerate the motor getting revved, it's not a very good vehicle. So you want the system to come online. That's a natural thing, to feel that like up regulation and alertness. So if you're going to go in and make a sale, you also don't want to be like, well, man, whatever. I don't really hear how this goes.
Maybe you want it, maybe you don't.
Yeah. Rather, you want to be like, hey, I'm going to be on and alert and aroused, paying attention to what's going on here. It's when things go too far. And so that physiology is a constant. But at what point that physiology, and to go to that kind of gears, right, is that we all have this kind of first through fifth, and fifth would be like the peak output in the machine. Well, a Ferrari F50 and a Volkswagen Bug both have first gear, but how fast they can go in first gear is very different. And that is the stress tolerance level in a person, right? And so what breath does is it takes away all the story shit. Like when you start controlling your breath, it's not about like, oh, I'm really nervous because this is the biggest sale I've ever made, or da 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 da. You're going straight to how the motor functions and keeping it level enough that you can get your shit together. That's when now, okay, I've brought my physiology down. This is where the mindset and the character you've developed over time, where at least in my experience, you have an opportunity to express them or change them. What I have seen is that people who have done good mindset work, it's not like those folks don't get stressed. Of course they do, right? They have a body that responds to the environment. But when they get there, whether it's breath or otherwise, they usually have a tool for maintaining the tach at a good level. And then they switch over to reliable thought patterns and systems that work. What happens to a lot of people who either haven't developed this or don't have the physiology part, they get here and then they have no system, no mindset, and it just kind of like, what? And you watch it happen. And people who aren't stress tolerant, this thing is just shaking. We saw this at S12, right? Is that as you start to add tasks and stress and stuff's going on and the line's changing more quickly and you're asking more of the participants, people who haven't either developed a good mindset around their approach to learning or that experience or how they take criticism, they tend to, even if they don't seem to be like out of breath or whatever, right? But you also have people who you can just see their physiology is just coming apart. And that is where, even though they have a good attitude and their mindset's good, it still blows the top off the system. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure.
So there's always this interplay between your your mind and your body, and there's this overlap point. And for us, the overlap point where you can insert skill is breath, and that's why we use it. Like I wasn't like a 20-year-old dude and like, what are you going to be when you grow up, Rob? And I was like, I'm going to teach breath work. That wasn't how I thought my future was going to go, but it is such an undeniable tool. And I'm such a pragmatist at heart that I was like, well, this works for like 20 things, and I could teach it to my grandma and I could teach it to a Navy SEAL like in the same day. And it'll work for both people. And it's really hard to find tools like that. And so when you find a tool like that and it's really repetitive and it's reliable, it's like, well, if I don't use it, it's almost irresponsible.
Right. I dig that. Let's talk a little bit about when people's tachometers get broken. So some people go from 0 to 10,000 RPMs with no point in between, and experienced panic disorder, panic attack,
Yep.
anxiety disorder. Talk a little bit about that and maybe some ways that people can improve that.
Sure. So I just want to say, first of all, I am not a mental health professional. So
And that's not really, and I don't think that that's what we're talking about, but I
we're
did.
not, but anxiety and panic disorder can be really serious. And so I just want to make sure that while breath work has like real and serious and researched implications for helping people with these problems, that having like a proper total therapeutic approach is really important. And I'm not saying that because like Rob Wilson wants to cover his ass in public right now. I'm saying it because it's a responsible thing to say as a practitioner.
I think that's good.
And so if you feel like you're having trouble with that stuff, go get help from a professional who understands both sides, who understands medication, talking, breath work, the full spectrum of tools that are available, because it's a multifaceted thing, and it deserves that kind of attention. With all that said, the tachometer can get broken and it can go in both ways. So we'll start, I'll kind of explain the overview and then we can kind of talk about the sort of the bifurcation. So the tachometer can get busted where any stimuli or a stimuli that's perceived as overwhelming can go from 0 to 10,000, right? The other end is the tach doesn't come on at all. And so some people, it should go on when it doesn't, and that's no good either,
So
right?
it's like a depressed person.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, and that could be clinical depression. That could be, really, we just like our colleague Emily Hightower, she calls it just like regulating low, right? Like the system's just down and there's this sweet spot of bandwidth that you want to be in. And when you tend to pop high, it means your threshold for certain types of stimulation are lower, right? So you can kind of think about it like a shallow pot sitting on your stove, right? Where the water doesn't have very high to go before the whole thing boils over. And the reason that that can happen is complex, but it's not complicated. So factors involved are, some factors are genetic, some factors are personality driven, right? So things that are intrinsic to you mixed with your environment, especially as a kid. And not because, not in like the, I don't mean that in like the Freudian, like, tell me about your mother kind of way necessarily, right? But what is important is that during developmental stages, that's when you're figuring out in the world what behaviors are safe, which ones are not. How do I identify certain types of threats in my environment? How do I protect myself emotionally? Like, how do I protect my feelings? That's what little kids are figuring out, right? That's why they touch hot stuff. That's why they say smart ass shit when they should. And they're just like, can I say this? What will happen? Can I do that? What will happen? And so you start to develop like an algorithm in your mind and your body with
What's
when
allowed.
exactly, once these 3 tumblers in the lock start to move, I better do this. And those all have an emotional component. And so what you can see is, and this, it was really cool to see it at S12 for me personally because of the buildup of stress. And so you can see, and it's not like, it's the stress of having to operate skills over increasing demand over the course of the 4 days. And you start to see like, what are people's mechanisms for dealing with, they didn't know what to do, or they made a mistake, or they got called out, or they accidentally did something unsafe, or like what's their operating system. And a lot of that was built way on levels of their body that they're not conscious of at all, right? So it's like that old iceberg picture. Like most of what's going on and that operates the system is happening below the surface level of the water. And what happens is people don't realize like what are those cycles until they go in a moment of stress, and then they blame the event. I did XYZ because this happened, because that's the most, what if they don't have any other information, that's
You were screaming at me, so I lost control.
right, that's the logical, right? And it's like, well, you reached your threshold of what you could tolerate. And then this happened. It has nothing to do with whether or not the screaming was justified whatsoever. Right. And so a lot of those systems are built in preconditions before we're adults. Now, what the hell does that have to do with breathing? Well, that part of your brain is really closely dovetailed with the part of you that operates your deep physiology, like breathing and blood pressure and heart rate and all that fight or flight, rest, digest parts of you is really interwoven with the part of you during development that figures out what's safe and where you're going and where you need to be and what's the social environment. Why? Well, because if you determine something in the environment is unsafe, you have to be able to take physical action in order to change it, change you, protect yourself. Like those all have associated physical mechanisms. And over time, those patterns build on patterns. And then it becomes more about a feel, right? And then it unlocks the tumbler like a safe in a James Bond movie. Like you get the beep boop beep beep, you get the right 4 numbers, and the whole thing pop 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 comes out. And so that's what happens with us. Unfortunately, most of us either never put ourselves in circumstances where we're forced to examine it, or if we are, we create a justification for our poor performance, attitude, mindset, or skill set, and don't seek out help because of many reasons like shame, denial, whatever. People don't seek out help for. But that's the kind of high side of the tachometer, that anxiety is a misunderstanding of what is potentially threatening in an environment, and then your system firing off. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean like seeing something threatening in the environment like it's literal. Like I go outside and see a truck, and because I'm feeling anxious, now I'm going to have, my breathing's going to go up. It's more like potential triggers that bump the physiology up, make the water in the pot get a little higher and a little higher. And you just don't notice them because they're not that close to the top yet. But then all of a sudden, someone comes over and dumps the contents of another pot in there, and then it all boils over. So the set points in the system are just adjusted high before there's an outward behavioral reaction. Sometimes anxiety is an appropriate emotion, right? It's just when anxiety becomes dread that it's a problem, like where there's a consistent fear of the future, that's dread, and that's a problem. Anxiety is appropriate. Like, when I was going to ask my wife, I was like old school. And when before I married my wife, I asked her dad permission, like not permission, but I asked for his blessing, right? I went to him and said, "Hey, Jay, like, I love your daughter. I care about your family." Before that conversation, I was anxious, right? Because he's somebody who I really respect. I wanted his blessing because it was really important to me to like say, "Hey, I want to be a part of your family unit," not just like, "Hey, dude, I'm going to marry your daughter, man." But like, "Hey, like, I understand what this is about." So I was nervous to talk to him. But I feel like anxiety in that situation is appropriate, right? It's just, what do you do with it? And that's what breath helps, is like, sometimes you feel anxious and it's right. But how do I use that physiological energy to my advantage? And that's really where breath comes in. And it helps you disconnect from the story of what's going on. Because, when we talk about external factors, even under ideal circumstances, they're mostly still outside of your direct control. And again, that's why you talk about things all the time, like, hey, are you building your systems? You put your firearm the way that you want to take it back out. There's all these redundancies built in because there's so many factors out there that we have no say over. And so I think it's really important to understand, like, oh, I have leverage into my body all the time. And when we have worked with people who have problems with anxiety, one of the most common pieces of feedback we get is, I felt like I was in control over something, right? Because people with anxiety or who are feeling overwhelming anxiety often feel like they're out of control because something that they logically know should not bother them does. And then they feel ashamed that it does. And it's like, if you bring it to body, it's not like a moral failing or like a failing of your will. It's like, hey, let's pull on the levers inside of your physiology And then, like I said, then you have enough time then where things aren't boiling over, where the emergency lights aren't flashing, that you can go, okay, wait a second, there's a whole mindset that's underneath this.
Yeah.
And so that's why breathwork stuff ends up seeming kind of mindset-y and like floofy. And the reason is because when you start to do it, you grab a hold over your physiology, and then that's like the next layer of shit that bubbles up is like your attitudes and your thoughts you go, oh man, that's the next layer down there.
Now I need to address this or pay
Now I got to
attention.
address this. Exactly.
This just got me thinking about a few things as I was listening to you. For example, I hear often from all kinds of people, Mick, you're training people to survive in violence. The fact is that person will never know how they'll really respond until they're there. And it's like, well, if that's the case, let's not practice anything and we'll just go do it. Right.
Yeah.
But like what I wanted to comment on in regards to that is, and this is dovetailing with what you just said, is once you start to realize that you have all of these little stresses in life and you become aware of them, and I'm talking more to the listener viewer than you, but I want you to comment on it. When you become aware of these, the ability for you to interact as you're describing, now you're building that system of how you respond to stress. And no, somebody attacking you in a parking lot at night is not the same as a bill being late. But I believe, as you already stated, internally, the way our body's processing that, it is very similar. The stresses that are happening. No, it's not the same, but it from a physiological level, it is, and how we force ourselves back into a state of control, and maybe that's not a good word, you comment on it, does build a system. And then as we find ourselves as a titration, right, we're giving ourselves more and more exposure, which we're exposed to this shit all the time anyway. We just choose to be like, let me smoke another cig, or let me swear at that guy in traffic, or let me go home and guzzle too much booze to go to sleep. We are already dealing with all these things. We just maybe are not coupling it to being better humans. Go ahead.
Back to you, Rob. Yeah. So, well, first of all, I'll say, just in regard, just to make sure I drive this point home, is that when we're talking about the physiological responses, they vary in degree and not kind. So, while you,
that's a great way to look at it. Yeah.
So I think that's really important is, if somebody's trying to attack you in a parking lot, or you have a bill late, that the physiological response, generally speaking, is very similar. It's just how heavy on the throttle. People who have, like we were talking about, the tachometer goes too high, can react to something like a bill being late much more similarly to actually being physically attacked than somebody who does not. And that's largely a function of, like I said earlier, a lot of other levels of brain parameter, like, just to be specific, like in the limbic area of the brain, which is the area that's developing and is trying to learn how to make sense of your environment. And so, yeah, people who have problems with anxiety, sometimes their physiological response to, the mugger situation is real similar to something like that.
I talk about this stuff all the time with people. I have a broken response system, probably from when I was a child. And well, not probably, I know exactly what it is, but I could get an email, like I got one today, and I didn't have a bad response, but in the history of my life, this email would have caused me an immediate dose of adrenaline and like a heart rate from 60 to 150, just sitting reading the email. A customer that was upset about something, and actually it wasn't even my fault. He just didn't know how to use the internet properly. But like it's irrational in the sense of, I know this isn't my problem. I know there's not really an issue here, but inside of me, my body's like, ooh, we got something going on here.
Yeah, so I'll say this is like, first of all, I think a problem that we have culturally right now is that people who are like that are like, it's seen as like a health problem right now to have a personality that runs hot. Like if you run hot, it's like we've swung the pendulum so far from like everybody works super hard all the time and gets shit done. And now the pendulum is starting to swing to like, almost to where it's like a virtue signal that you don't work much. And, there's this dichotomy that's going
like
on.
I live in my van and I
right.
take
And so
pictures of every sunset, like that kind of shit.
yeah,
which is cool.
Which is whatever. Right. But my point is that one major factor that informs those expressions of behavior is personality. And so I'll give you an example, and she won't mind me talking about this because she's been on podcasts with me before, but my wife is like you, right? She runs hot, right? Like she runs hot.
If I run hot, do I run hot?
If you get pissed off because you get an email,
it's not pissed off. Not pissed off. I didn't say pissed off. It's not anger. It's an adrenaline response, though.
Right. But that's what I'm saying.
And it's not even an emotional thing. I can feel the physiological effects, but I don't have an emotional response to it because since I was 25 years old, I know what's happening. But
right.
And that doesn't happen all the time. But
so that means
I'm not angry.
But that just means that you have it under your control because you've adulted to a large degree, right? So that's the same with her. Like she's not running around like flying off the handle and throwing coffee cups because only when I ask for it. But she just runs, and when I say she runs hot, I mean like she does a lot in a day. She says a lot in a day. She's on the move. She's doing stuff, and also like, let's say we were out somewhere and somebody like talked a little shit or said something, she'd be the one who was like, she'd like pop off some sarcastic comment back, whereas I'd be like, she's more of a fiery personality, but also prone to anxiety because of levels of stimulation and then how the physiology was wired over time because of other stuff with her. And so some of it is a function of personality expression. It's just like you just want to make sure that part of you is serving outcomes that you want. So like what do you want? There's nothing wrong with being like somebody who's motivated, type A, getting things done. I have respect for people who the good things that come from running a little hot. The downside is when you're having a response that doesn't help you exist in the world the way that you want, when there's a disconnect. And so that's where a tool like breathwork can help. It's like, it's not going to make you not you. And sometimes people don't realize that that's what they are asking me for. I don't want to be like that. And I'm like I have private clients. I'm like, well, what's wrong with that? Like your life, like the actual life you built for yourself is pretty rad. Like you have good relationships with your family and you make good money and stuff's really going well for you because you're like, and analyzing problems. And when something comes up, you take care of it right now. And there's no procrastination because it's always right now. And that has some good outcomes. It's just that you want to mitigate the negativity. And that's what everybody's trying to do. So I try to encourage people, like when they're thinking about how they want to use breath stuff, especially if it is for something like relieving anxiety, to just help them mitigate the downsides, but to also realize that some of the proclivities that lead to those things they have positive outcomes as well, and to try to think about what they are and leverage them on your own behalf. But yeah, I think, just to kind of take a hard turn. You know, training is something that I think about a lot. And, you know, what you were saying earlier about not training at all. So people say, hey, why would you train for this kind of situation? Like, you never know what's going to happen. So why bother? You know, why do it? And so, and I'm going to try to tie this back to what we were already talking about, but all training is essentially like trying to reduce variables.
Okay.
Right? Like, that's the whole point of training something, so that when X happens, like a predictable Y happens. Like, training is all predicated on that a predictable outcome is available. And the more you train, the more predictable the outcome gets. So it's like, if you look at a fast motor pattern of someone who's inexperienced, there's a lot of variability, and that's why they have so much error, right? Like, if you look at somebody, like, you're just drawing and shooting a pistol, it's like, people who are new to it, they do a different thing every time. But you look the same. Like, how many times you've done that? It looks the same every time. Looks the same.
Sure.
And I'm not an expert, but on the obvious notes, right? There's way less variability. And that's the whole point of training anything, is to reduce variability. So when you look at how does that apply for breath work? If you have a variable response to every stressful situation, it's really hard to know, can I predict the outcome that's going to happen for me and how I behave and how I feel? Because I have no training and how to adjust my physiology. So the whole point of when we're talking about real-time breath work is to be able to sense and then adjust your behavioral outputs, so that, you know, okay, no matter what's all this stuff, it's the same. It's like the same draw stroke, but with my physiology.
I like
Right.
that.
So it's gonna be, oh, I feel this. Let me make sure I don't go too far. Like, don't get into the, you know, sort of boiled over water state, right? Because I've trained it enough, I've repeated it enough that the variables are low. So it's like, when I feel, it's kind of like when I told you in Z about that little mantra of like, shooting is fun. You know, I was getting nervous on the line. We were doing walk and shoot, and I was nervous about, you know, moving and like changing the pistol direction, you know, changing muzzle direction while I was moving, because I hadn't moved and shot in like years up to that point. And I could feel, as I got closer, like, I was getting a little bit more tight, like in my posture and like my face. But I had an early sensation of that because I had trained myself to pay attention to it. So it's not like I'm walking around all the time like, what is my breath cadence? Da, da, da. It's just that I've put in reps. So now when it starts to happen, I start to have that beginning of the stress response. I notice it, and I just take note, like, is this too far, or is this where I do good?
Mm-hmm.
And it started to go too far. And I took a breath, and I was like, had a conversation, right? Because I took the breath, I addressed the physiology first before it got too wound up, right? Address the physiology, and then the mentality came in. Hey man, just relax. Like, you like to shoot. Shooting is fun. Those are the words I said to myself. And then every time after that, I was just like, shooting is fun. And if I was starting to feel too ramped up, shooting is fun. Like, address the physiology, address your mindset, address your physiology, address your mindset. And that's a really easy way to start to like deploy techniques like this as well.
Which, for the layman, that was meditation. You chose something to fixate on, and that was going to provide the outcome you wanted.
Exactly.
And there was duality there, which is great.
Yep. And so the tools are really easy to use. And I think sometimes it gets too, like, the terminology, even some of the modern terminology is too esoteric for people.
Give me an example, please.
Sure. So even like an example of a mistake that we've made, I'll give that a real good example is, we talk about CO2 tolerance in physiology, and, we're really interested in breath work and energy systems and da 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 da. That kind of language is too esoteric for someone who's trying to engage in a direct outcome. Like right now on the line, I'm getting nervous and I want to shoot better. Right. And so the that's the sort of scientific modern Western esoterics is science speak, because whether it's your professional background or you just want to have elevated speech, the other side is like the yoga stuff. When people talk about pranayama this and pranayama that, and it's not context appropriate. And so, I mean, pranayama is actually like a really amazing terminology to use in regards to what that does. It just means breath control. That's all pranayama means. And it also means energy. People think that means like woo woo light shooting out of your hands, but like your body has to use energy to function. So whoever thought of that was like, oh yeah, breath and energy, they're the same thing. It's actually physiologically correct. But when you say things like pranayama, or you start to use Ayurvedic terminology, it loses folks. And so I think, even sometimes if it's esoteric within a certain culture, it's like you want to have language that I could say to a doctor, and I could say to a SEAL, and I could say to my grandma. And that's why I like gears, because everybody has sense of gears in a car or gears on a bike, and that they change based on like how hard you're working. And that kind of makes sense to folks. But I think it's also easier to access in moments of stress if you have to try to remember a language that's not super familiar to your brain, whether it's scientific or like yogic. If it's not in some terminology that's already that it's relatable or is part of the menu, then you're not going to actually deploy it when it matters the most. You'd be too caught up in like, what is the sea? Was it the vineyard? I don't.
Sure.
So I don't remember your original question.
No, that's all good stuff. Let's change gears a little bit. To people watching, listening, I think there's tons for them to chew on. You guys that have viewed thus far, if that amount of information does not stir you to dig deeper into the topics that we're talking about, then I got nothing for you. How about this? We're about the same age-ish. Longevity, training, and general health and wellness. Most of our viewers are men. Everybody wants to be, strong and fit. Like, damn, my elbows are hurting right now. My shoulders hurting. And I take pretty good care of myself. Like, just talk on that a little bit.
Okay. Well, I'll start with this and I promise it'll get more cheery and helpful. But first of all, things fall apart and you're going to die. True. And it's just
that's every morning I wake up, I feel like that. So you said shooting is fun. I love shooting. I get out of bed and I go, you're falling apart. You're gonna die. I'm just joking. I don't.
No, and that's me neither. But I think it's important to what I have noticed, especially for myself. So I'm going to be 41 in a couple of days, and I work with lots of guys who are either still currently super studs or were previously super studs. And they just want to like, oh, I'm going to ride that same line right off to the cliff.
Right.
And you can do that because that's what's at the edge of that line is a cliff. But no matter what, the system is breaking down, and as you age, your task is to mitigate that breakdown, right? So you're standing in front of a boulder that's rolling down a hill, and you're trying to keep that sumbitch from rolling down faster than you want it to.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason that I say that first is not to be negative, but to always make sure that, especially as athletes age, that we have realistic expectations about how much training volume we can handle, that there's a history behind this body that is still that has current effects on the way it works, how much it can handle, what it can handle, how much did you invest in that history. So somebody who's started exercising and eating well when they're 13 and now they're 40, they're a different biological age than somebody who hasn't done shit and then today is like, Rob convinced me I'm doing stuff. So even though both of those people are 40, it doesn't mean that they have the same stress tolerance available in their bodies.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say those are factors to take into serious consideration. And then, so it's just about setting realistic expectations, and then getting guidance is really important. But if you're just talking about, I mean, there's so much stuff to mitigate things like, I don't know if you really want me to talk more about like direct things like, hey, what supplements should you guys be thinking about?
I think it's a good thing to discuss. Like, everybody's always looking for the silver bullet magic, solution. And I, of course, don't think there is one. I'm in pretty good shape for a dude in his mid 40s, and guys will ask me what I do. And it's like, well, it's probably more what I don't do than what I do. And there's definitely things I do, and I can only speak for myself, but then I see other guys that are older than me that are just like in phenomenal shape when you see them out in public. But then I see these guys in private, and it's almost like on stage when they're out and not that they're hiding anything, but it's like they're good. They go to the gym or can go to the range or go to the mats, and they can perform. And I know a couple guys that are very famous dudes on social media. They're famous trainer, instructor guys. But as soon as they're not in front of people, these dudes are like wrapped in ice, popping pills, freaking laying in, bathtubs, and like they're like on the edge of busting. You know what I mean? I don't want that either.
Exactly. Well, and here's the thing is pick your poison. So, and by that, what I mean is if you want to be a high performer, you got to pay. There's no free ticket on any of these boats, whichever one you choose. You want to be the longevity guy, your peak performance probably won't be the same. It just won't be, right? It's not as high of a mountain. The downside of a really high peak is the other side where you come tumbling back down, right? And
this
so
is like when you see like a guy that was a world famous bodybuilder that now they're like, wait, that looks like Mickey with his shirt off. Like, what the hell happened? Well, I just saw Dorian Yates on a video the other day and was like, what? That guy used to have like 38-inch biceps.
He was all time, right? Even like if anybody's familiar with Louis Simmons of West Side Barbell, like that dude, they were like, oh my God, you've done all these steroids. And he was like, hell yeah. And I'm doing them forever. And I'm going to lift hard forever. And I don't care if I explode. And he has made and the reason I respect him is not because I feel the same way myself. I'm not like that personally, but he has accepted responsibility for the outcome that like I have decided to give my body. I don't care if my joints hurt and my back hurts and I know that that's the reality. I'm not going to blame somebody else or try to have a physiological utopia where I don't have to pay any price. I'm just going to live forever and never feel bad and nothing's going to ever hurt. I've accepted that. Now, the other side of that coin is completely ignoring physiological signals that your body tells you that, hey, you need to back off. And that's more about optimizing adaptation, which is, I think, when we say longevity, even people who I hear who are like longevity specialists, they're really still talking about optimizing adaptability, because longevity is there's no guarantee of longevity in a human. Sure. There's not, there are markers and we can say, hey, this helps, but there's, at the end of the day, there's no guarantor that even if you do everything right, you could still die, right? So we're just talking, what we're really talking about is optimal adaptation. in that, I agree with you that the first thing is to have less negative inputs than positive. More positive inputs than negative. And so you want to reduce negative. A lot of times, and this, one of the things that speaks to me right away is, I'm a jiu-jitsu guy like you, and guys in there at almost every time I'm in a training session, somebody asks me a question about training or whatever. And a lot of guys ask me like about supplements. So supplements do you take this supplement, do you take that supplement? Have you tried this company? Have you tried that company? And I'm like, I mean, I can tell you about it, but how's your sleep? I'm like, oh man, it's actually pretty shitty. And like, I never seen this dude drinking like Diet Coke during practice, and he's overweight. And it's like, what? Creatine is not enough. Creatine is not your problem, bro. Your problem is that you need to learn how to go to bed on time. You need to drink some water, and like, like I have my bottle in there, and the guys are like, oh man, Rob, what concoction do you have in there? I'm like, well, it's tap water with actually a scoop of creatine and Himalayan sea salt, and I'll squeeze a lemon in there. They're like, really? And I'm like, yeah, if you actually understood what you need in order to avoid like cramping and stay hydrated, you would stop spending like $5 a bottle on that bullshit, and you would just sprinkle some salt and lemon in your bottle and just shake it up yourself. Like, it's not that, it's, for most people, it's not that complex. If you want to win the Olympic gold medal, you better know your levels. But if you're just like an average dude who wants to like be able to go hard with his buddies at the gym or the beach or on the range or whatever, it's not as complicated as we make it. There are some supplements that are definitely have so much research behind them at this point that they're almost universally helpful. Creatine for sure is one of them.
I don't think I've ever eaten creatine. Should I eat creatine?
For me personally, I can say on top of the mountains of research behind it at this point, it's my personal anecdote, and I'm not a supplement dude. I'm not like a guy who's into a lot of supplements. I only take a couple. And creatine, there's a noticeable difference. And how I feel when I work out, how I feel when I train in jiu-jitsu, I know it's definitely for real. There's tons of research about it. It helps with muscular endurance. There's a bunch of research being done by neurologists right now. It helps with cognitive function, big time with cognitive function. It's just because it's a precursor for ATP, which is like the energy molecule in your body. Mm-hmm. And so it just helps you, it upregulates ATP. And so anytime you can upregulate the amount of available energy, things go better.
Can you eat too much of it?
I don't know that there's evidence of anybody overdosing on creatine. It's a naturally occurring thing. Like you get it in other, like if you're eating steak, you're mm-hmm. getting it, but, I wouldn't try. I mean, I can't, there's a point of diminishing returns. They know that really anymore. If I remember, if it's like, I want to say it's like more than 10 grams is like the upper limit of usability for most. Like for me, I just take like 5 grams a day. It's like a little teaspoon that I put in the first glass of water that I drink every day. And that's it. Like, it's not like that's why I like it too. Because once something becomes like a big deal, I get resistant to it. Like I don't want reliance. It's like I drink a glass of water when I wake up anyway. So I just go like this, and then it does the thing that I want it to do when I want it to do it.
Do you travel with it?
No. I know people that travel with supplements. I have traveled with supplements before. I'm a big fan of so I'm not an athlete who's training for peak performance. If I was like a professional athlete, or I had to have an on-demand performance outcome at a specific time, you bet your ass I would travel with a supplement. No question about it. But I think as a human being, it's so easy to create an attachment. Like, this creatine helps me with this X. And so I better make sure, oh, when I go out of town, I'm going to go to this jujitsu school and I want to make sure I roll with those guys is good. And so this creatine will make sure I have these are the kind of conversations that we all have internally, but don't want to admit. And so for me, I don't like that kind of like, oh, am I going to do is good? No.
I'm with you.
That's going to stay home. And now I'm going to purposefully go, okay, everything's not perfect. Like, you're not with people who you know and care about you. You don't have all your supplements. You didn't sleep as much. Like, I think it's important to I'm all about optimization. Sleep when you can, how you should, where you can, when you can. But also, I think sometimes the pendulum swings where if there's any like perturbations in people's rhythm, they just like, oh, I didn't get 8.7 hours of sleep, and according to statistics that I saw on MSNBC that I don't really understand, if I get less than 8.7 hours, then I'm going to die a year earlier. It's like, what?
That kind of goes back to what we said about people that have a weak constitution. For real.
Yeah.
Like, yes. Oh shit, I gotta freaking unload that truck. I gotta walk from the back of the parking lot. Just like, don't be a pussy. Yeah, you'll be okay.
To me, one of the cruxes of human beings is that we're here because we have the most potential to adapt to the widest range of conditions, and we should be happy about that and work to preserve it and not shrink it. Because we don't run fast and we can't climb very well. Even like Alex Honnold, like sucks compared to like an average monkey.
Sure.
Right. We're not strong. We don't swim well, but we are smart and we know how to multiply our power through cooperation. And because of that, we're super robust species, but we're starting to like narrow our tolerances, and that's not good. I don't think that's a direction anybody should aspire to, with one or two exceptions. Like if you're a professional athlete, by definition, you're like narrowing your tolerances a lot, right? Things get so boxed because you have such a precise performance outcome, but the potential upside is so high that's worth it, right? So whenever you hyper specialize, there has to be a really high value reward on the other side of it. Otherwise, at least in my opinion, it's not worthwhile.
I dig it. And we covered a ton of topics and concepts here. What would a couple things. One, I want you to make sure everybody knows how to find you, and we'll put that in the description of the video and podcast. But what would you leave people with if they never met you, if they don't come to one of your training programs, if they never read the things that you write online or the books and visit with you? What would you leave them with?
Take a deep breath. It's okay. Right? Shooting is fun. And honestly, though, that goes right back earlier, which is your physiology. It's easy to grab a hold of your physiology first and then address mindset. So when I say like take a deep breath, it's okay. Take a deep breath. Shooting is fun. That's the actual deployment of grab your body and then direct your mind, right? So take a deep breath, and then whatever mantra helps you start going in the direction you want, then do it. Use it.
Choices.
It's what we got.
How do people find you?
You can go to shiftadapt.com. That's the website for Brian McKenzie and I, and tons of information at shiftadapt on Instagram. My personal Instagram handle is at prepare to perform. Yeah, those are the big ones.
I dig it. You guys that have watched this, if you want to come train with him and me, you can come to the Next S12, which is in Nashville, Tennessee in May of 2022. It's going to be awesome. Z Durham will be there. Brian is usually at that event as well. He's got a wedding that weekend, which is cool, but whatever. We've got Big Rob that's going to be there. It's going to kick ass. Paul Sharp's going to be there. Our friends from D-Day Response Group will be there, as well as a couple other awesome people. Chef Kent's going to be preparing the food. It's an all-inclusive kind of a deal. Training includes everything that Rob's been talking about. We do TCCC, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, with our friends from D-Day Response Group. You learn the most cutting edge tactical medicine for the layman. We do tons of pistol shooting and some hand-to-hand combatives with Paul and Z, as well as some other fun stuff. And it's in a beautiful setting in the hills outside of Nashville, Tennessee. If you dug this podcast, if you've got questions for me or for Rob, shoot us an email. Tell somebody you love them. Don't be dickheads, and walk a higher line. Visit our website, CarryTrainer.com, for information about classes held throughout the U.S., CarryTrainer apparel, and upcoming projects. You can also email us at training@CarryTrainer.com for information about setting up your own private course or speaking engagement. Training@CarryTrainer.com or CarryTrainer.com. What are you doing in the podcast room, Steve?
I'm writing a national anthem. It's going to be at folk festivals for gunfighter gun oil.
Oh.
Let me tell you about gunfighter gun hire. Made in the USA. Gunfighter gun oil. 100% synthetic. It's gonna last you, baby. Yeah. Gunfighter gun oil is the best I've ever seen. It's gonna make you get everything that you've ever seen. Oh, baby, I love me some gunfighter gun oil. Yeah. Oh, gunfighter gun oil. Gunfighter.
Gonna get my lighter out. I don't have it.
It wasn't even Bob Dylan. It was like a love story.